Greetings YouTube and welcome to the Blue Corner into a Cardfight deck profile. This one going to be for Overdress format and the last of the decks that I currently have built. And it is Zorga, the Grand Blue looking deck coming out of set 1 that, truth be told, is probably the one I was most excited for. Especially given how Eugene turned out to be, well, bad. But Zorga ended up being what I was hoping for and a little bit more, as its playstyle is very Grand Blue-esque. But it's also a little bit different because of how Alchemist works. And truth be told, Zorga's playstyle reminds me of like something you'd see out of Pokemon, given that your gimmick is being able to cheat a second copy, or rather a second order during your turn, when normally you can only play one order per turn, which reminds me of decks that would try and get around the one supporter card limit. And I can't remember if there was any that allowed you to directly like cheat to supporter cards. I remember like the one Sableye could look at your opponent's hand and play a supporter from it, and alongside the supporter in your own, but I don't know if I've done anything else since. But getting off track here, but yeah, overall though, I like the playstyle, or rather I like the look of this deck, I like its playstyle, and it's something that can only get better as time goes on because of the way it plays. Graveyard toolboxing is always one of the stronger strategies in a card game. And the fact that this guy benefits off of normal orders means that anytime a strong normal order comes up in Stoicheia, that's something you got to consider with this deck. So that being said, let's get into it. So as far as the ride line goes, I'm playing, of course, the better looking starter for Stoicheia, the Ranker Chain, who on Vanguard Circle allows you to once per turn Soul Blast 1, draw 2 cards, and then choose up to 1 order from your hand and discard it. Otherwise, you discard 2. So it's a potential cycle 2 or a straight +1. Filtering is always very good. Even the Magnolia deck plays this guy because it's better than their other starter. And yeah, this helps put orders in your drop zone, which is necessary for Alchemagic, and you can also tutor him back with the effect of your grade 2. He also has a Rearguard skill to get 2,000 power if you played an order during your turn, or rather during this turn, but that doesn't really come up because you almost never call this guy. There's just a better grade 1. Then the grade 2, Black Tears Husk Dragon, so when placed on Vanguard, adds 1 normal order from your drop zone to your hand, and then on Rearguard Circle, if you played an order during this turn, he gets 5k. Now, if I'm correct, this triggers during your opponent's turn if you play a Blitz order, which is pretty good for letting him to just randomly get to 15k, and that'll be important when the next set drops and we've got Leonard trying to smack over this thing, so you could Ghost Chase targeting this to give it 5k, and then his own effect triggers making him a 20k. Or you Ghost Chase another unit, and then this guy gets 5k on his own, which is kind of relevant. And then, yeah, like he's your best beater as far as grade 2 goes for the time being. And as such, I'm running a little more poppies. And then lastly, you got your boss monster, Zorga. So his second effect I'll go over first because it's just a typical Grand Blue effect. Counterblast 1, choose a unit in your drop zone, call it to Rearguard Circle. Not much else to really say here, like it's basically Basskirk except without the extra stuff. And it's a very, granted, there's no power or any other special stuff might seem like a downside, but the fact is that you've got cards that work off of being called, or you've got a card that can bounce stuff back. So like this effect is more of a setup effect for your more powerful order plays. So that's alright. Like I was afraid it would be like Counterblast 1, Soul Blast 1, especially since this deck doesn't have Soul Charge outside of Persona rides, and that's nice. Secondly, his main effect, Alchemagic, which is an ability that triggers when you play a normal order from your hand. You can bind a different named normal order from your drop zone, and then pay both costs simultaneously, then apply the effects of that bound card after using the effects of the first order. So, for instance, if I play the one that's a Monster Reborn from hand, and I have the one in the drop zone that allows me to buff units by 10,000 power, I can bind it, call my card from drop zone, then apply the 10k buffs across the 3 different units. The Yu-Gi-Oh player in me is trying to not assume it's the other way around, where I play normal order, chain Zorga, and then apply the effects of the one from the drop zone first. But yeah, aside, that's why I had to kind of reshoot this video, because I got it wrong the first time around. I had to clarify, but yeah, being able to cheat 2 orders out in a turn is really good, especially as more generic and just more normal orders for Stoicheia come up. And it's, as a result, it creates this playstyle where you're just powering up, building a board, swinging, but it also means that if you aren't able to play an order during your turn, you're turn just becomes super flat because you have no power or board building. Then for the remaining grade 3s, I'm playing 3 more copies of Zorga. As I mentioned before, this deck doesn't soul charge, and it does have soul blasts for its effects. And this is probably your best way of building it, as well as just Persona Riding's really strong. Now, more copies of this card may get cut when the new set drops just to make room for other stuff. That remains to be seen. Seen some people talk about playing 1 Zorga or only 2. Now, that is something that at least I like about Overdress formats. You can actually consider only playing a couple copies of your boss monster just because the ride deck exists. Then for the grade 2s, probably the most important one in here is Hendrina, whose skill is when placed, you can mill 3 on Rearguard Circle, which is really good. Like a deck playing out of its graveyard, being able to mill is always good. And then another effect is you can retire her to make the first time you use a Soul Blast cost for your order, as far as Alchemagic goes, become 0, which is really good because a couple of your orders Soul Blast, and because Alchemagic applies the costs at the same time, if you play an order from your hand that Soul Blasts and bind an order from your drop zone that also Soul Blasts, both effects become 0 because it's simultaneous. At least that's from what I was able to find out when I asked the question. And yeah, as a result, Hendrina will see play for a good amount of time because your stronger order, 2 of your orders Soul Blast versus the one that counterblasts, and this deck doesn't really counterblast a lot. It's just Zorga and your 1 order. And then the 2 more copies of the Dragon here, as he is your better beater. Then moving on to the grade 1s, 4 copies of the Rare PG because, yep, it's just better. And 4 copies of the Mantis because, yes, that thing I mentioned about Rancor Chain being not really needed as a rearguard, it's because this guy exists. When he's placed, you can choose one of your other rearguards, and it gets 5k into the end of the turn, which helps you hit for good numbers, as a Husk Dragon Adamantus column by itself is 18. His effect makes it 23, so that forces out a 15k shield. If this guy's effect is active, then that goes to 28, therefore your opponent has to 20k guard it. So those little bits help, and if you call 2 out at the same time, then yeah, it's effectively 10k spread across, divided among the column or such, or rather a row or such. And yeah, Mantis is good, and he'll probably see some play in even set 2 format, as the jury's out on whether or not Headhunter is strictly better than this or not, as both have 5,000 power gains. It's just it's different. This guy allows a rearguard to hit bigger, whereas the Headhunter himself gets big, and he makes your next counterblast cost for an order Alchemagic play no counterblast. But like I said before, the counterblast costs in this deck are not frequent, so that's why there's still debate on whether or not Headhunter is needed. Then for the orders, first off, 3 copies of Grief, Despair, and Rejection, which I'm just going to say is Grief now. And its effect is you counterblast 1. If Zorga is your Vanguard, you choose up to 3 of your units, and or rather you just choose 3 of your units, and they get 10,000 power until end of turn. This is what allows you to hit your good numbers, and it's the only order in this deck that counterblasts, so it makes combos very nicely with Condensation. And it's probably going to be the order that sticks around in when the next set drops. Then 3 copies of Cursed Souls, Squirming in Agony. This one requires you to Soul Blast 2. You look at the 4 cards on the top of your deck, and you call 1 to rearguard, and you mill the rest. But if this is part of Alchemagic instead, you can call 2, and the cards called by this effect get 5,000 power. Not much to really say here. Like, I've had some really iffy luck with this thing as far as what I call as it's been mostly 3 or even 4 triggers, and that just makes me die a little inside. But hey, you can still always bounce the triggers back for Ghost Chase, which I've mentioned a couple times now, so let's get into it. So 3 copies of Ghost Chase, the Blitz order. So this effect is you choose one of your rear guards, and it gets 5,000 power until the end of that battle. Or rather, choose one of your units, gets 5,000 until the end of the battle. Then you choose one of your rear guards that is not being attacked, and you return it to the hand. This is what I meant by how Zorga can, his call ability is really good for setup stuff, as you can call a copy of Zorga itself, bounce it back to Persona Ride. If you milled or guarded with your over trigger, you can bounce it back. You can bounce back to PG. Yeah, this is a pretty solid order, and it should be able to trigger Black Tears Husk Dragon as well as Headhunter during your opponent's turn, which is good for the Bruce matchup. But there is talk about whether or not this card is going to continue to see play when the new set drops, based on what kind of build you're going for, an aggro build or a less aggro build and whatnot. And then the last order, and one of the stronger ones in here, is Spiritual Body Condensation. For Soul Blast 1, you choose a unit with choose a card in your drop zone whose grade is equal to or less than your Vanguard, and you call it to bear and it gets 5,000 power. It is a Monster Reborn, and that's really cool. Like, Condensation is just a free 1-for-1, but it calls back anything who's based on what Vanguard grade you're on, more or less. And it, alongside Zorga, allows you to call a column, a back row. And with Grief, you can call a unit and then just make your guys swole. Then for the triggers, I am running the also classic Grand Blue setup of as many crits as possible, because you don't want to be playing draws, because this deck nils and therefore it will deck out. I just gotta get all my triggers in order. For some reason they are kind of bunched up weird, but yes, I insist I'm playing 8. In fact, there we are. So 8 critical triggers, 4 heals, and like I said, since I'm not playing draws, I'm playing fronts instead. And lastly, the over trigger, as even though the Stoicheia over trigger isn't the most flashy, it just applies, it basically applies every trigger available into one. You draw a card, give a unit a crit, buff your front row by 10k, and if you have more damage to your opponent, you heal a card. Yeah, it's probably the most like okay of the over triggers, like not the weakest but also not the strongest, and because it's an over trigger you still play it. And that's pretty much it for the deck, so we'll just do a final summary. And that is it for the deck in a nutshell. So all in all, pretty fun deck to play, and it's definitely one that can get better over time. It just depends on what kind of support the deck gets. At least better than what it got in set 2. Oh boy. And then anytime a good normal order for a Stoicheia gets printed that isn't locked behind certain named Vanguards, then it's something that this deck can take a look at. Like say for the upcoming Aquaforce inspired deck for Stoicheia in set 3, if they get a normal order that turns any unit into Tidal Assault and it's not locked behind the Flag Vanguard, then that's something that this deck can take a look at, because the Shark suddenly can restand and is a battle door by itself already. So you've got that. And I'm expecting this deck to get maybe a double rare when the new set drops, but I don't think they're going to get another triple rare. Mind you, if they're of the same power level as Headhunter, it probably wouldn't be a very good triple rare anyway. Like, I know I'm kind of like shitting on Headhunter, but like you look at that card and then you look at Leonard or Urgar, and it's like, this isn't really quite of the same power level. And that's kind of like Zorga's issue going into the next set, is while it's okay right now, it doesn't really get tremendously better in set 2. It gets more, I guess what would be described as a side grade rather than an upgrade. It gets more stuff that allows it to do its thing, but its weaknesses don't really get patched up, and everything around it kind of just gets better. Yeah, so like Orphis, which this deck was constantly compared to, already gets better quality stuff. Nirvana, which this deck was also compared to, gets a lot better thanks to Urgar. And Prison, which was considerably worse in this deck, gets quite a bit of jump as far as its power goes, just because its cards are just really strong. And yeah, I'm kind of hoping that set 3 is able to print something that helps fix this deck's issues of consistency being the big one, as when Zorga is able to do its stuff, it's good. And like, it's pretty strong, but when you can't do its thing, then you kind of start to struggle. As I kind of mentioned before, like of all the regions that we had that BSFOs going on, only one Zorga player was able to top compared to the number of Orphists and what have you. So yeah, it will be a long road for this deck to become the tier 1 deck that we thought it was going to be, but I think it can get there eventually. And that's all I really got to say for now. So comment down below on what you're doing with your Zorga decks when the next set drops. Are you going to be maxing out on Zorga? Are you cutting it? Are you going to keep Ghost Chase? Are you going to cut it? How are you going to fit all these cards that Zorga got going in? Because while Headhunter itself may be iffy, there's a couple good orders coming out of this set, and I'm curious as to what's going to get cut to make room for all this stuff. And until next time, this is Blue Star 89, jacking out.